Today is an exciting day. It's time to move off-grid. I started my solar adventure with a grid-tied 9 kilowatt solar system. Then I added a simple inverter charger and two 5 kilowatt hour server rack batteries to provide a small emergency backup for power outages. Later, I expanded the capacity to 25 kilowatt hours and added split phase capability with another inverter. Today, I'm going to add a solar charge controller and the Cerbo GX to the system. Now, instead of just an emergency backup system, all of my essential circuits will be running completely off-grid. I'm powering my security system, internet, TV, essential lighting, well, refrigerator, microwave, and kitchen appliances completely off-grid. I'm using the Cerbo GX to monitor and post the information on the web, so you can see the real-time performance right on my website, projectswithdave.com. Welcome back to Projects with Everyday Dave. It's time for the next step in moving off-grid. The materials for this project aren't super complicated. Because of the modularity of the Victron system, we're just going to add a solar charge controller to all of our existing components. I'm also going to include the Cerbo GX. That will give me a lot more control over everything the system is doing and a little bit more control over some of the special capabilities. I'm going to add surge protectors for the MPPT inputs. I'll need one of these for each of the inputs I'm going to connect. And then I need fuses to go in the links distributor for the input for the solar charge controller. I have MC4 connectors for all of my solar panel connections, and I'm going to need several hundred feet of 10 gauge UV resistant PV wire for my connections at the panels. I'll also need some 10 gauge THHN for the runs from the panels to the house. I'm going to be replacing the battery cables from the battery to the links distributor with 2-aught cable, and from the links distributor to my solar charge controller with 2-aught. That way I can utilize the maximum output of the solar charge controller. There are two different size solar charge controllers that Victron puts out. This is the larger one, and I want to be able to use all of it and show what the maximum capability is. I also have some cable lugs to make up the different length cables I need to make. Current Connected will make whatever size cable you need pre-made for you. However, I don't know exactly what size cable I want, and I always make little adjustments, so it's easier for me to just make them on the spot. If you watched my previous video on setting up my distribution control center for all of my PV inputs, I have breakers in there to disconnect the power and control the power flowing through the PV wires. However, I'm also going to add this DC disconnect closer to the unit. That way, when I'm making changes to the system or I need to get in there, I don't have to run over and disconnect the power at the breaker. I can just flip the switch right next to the inverter. It gives me a little bit more control and a little extra safety. Maybe not entirely necessary. And that's pretty much all we need, so let's get it installed. All right, we'll get started by hanging the unit on the wall. It's not terribly heavy, and the hanging bracket makes it even easier. I need to make sure there's at least 10 centimeters or 4 inches between the units themselves, and this particular charge controller needs 300 millimeters above and below the unit, which is about a foot for airflow. There we go, super simple. Now I just need to run a couple screws to the bottom corner and we can start wiring it up. In order to accommodate the significant current that we can add to the batteries using this solar charge controller, I'm going to change out these 1-aught cables to 2-aught. So I'm going to turn all this off and disconnect the battery and its cables and start rerouting everything from the inverter to the distributor and from the distributor to the battery with 2-aught cable. Since I'll be adding the Cerbo GX for monitoring, I won't need the local shunt display. So I'll replace the Victron BMV712 with the cheaper Smart Shunt. I just want to confirm that there's no voltage on this before I get started because there's capacitors in these units, and even with them off, it takes a while for them to drain. 1.1 volts, I think we'll survive that, so we can get moving on this. I'm going to use this third position on the links distributor and roughly lay out the length of my cable. I want to go from the positive here. That's going to lay right in here, right about like that. So just mark that. Man, these ratcheting cutters are the best way to cut through this cable. When I first got this wire stripping tool, I didn't like it, but now that I have some practice and the depth set properly, I like it a lot. If you're looking for a source for any of the tools that I use, you can find them on the Tools tab of my website, projectswithdave.com. Using 2-aught 5/16 lugs. I'll set my crimper to 2-aught, actually just a little tighter than 2-aught. I like to put 2 crimps in the big ones. That is solid. Measure out a little heat shrink tube. There we go, make up the rest. I'll connect the battery cables first so I can get power to the unit and make sure all the programming is correct before I connect the PV. The charge controller manual gives 14 Newton meters as the torque setting, and I'm using that for all these cable connections. There we go. I'll be using a 250 amp fuse because that's what's required by the charge controller. Then the positive cable goes right on top, and I can torque the cable and fuse nut to complete the circuit. With the cables routed, I can torque the other end to 14 Newton meters. Now I can turn on the inverters or connect the battery and have power to the charge controller for programming. I should have connected the chassis ground before I connected the battery cables, but we'll put it in now. There's a chassis ground, there's no AC connection, so the only way to make sure that this system is grounded is to use this chassis ground post. I'll use a green number 6 ground wire with crimped terminals on the end. I plan to power my off-grid essential circuits from this new firewood storage rack I built out of mostly recycled materials. I'm going to do a whole video on this build, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. It's not quite finished yet. So, for my first test string, I'm going to shift a row of these Mission Solar panels off of my Solar Edge inverter and over to the Victron inverter. In order to do that, I need to run some PV wire so I can have a separate string from the one that's operating now. Fortunately, I got 500 feet on a spool, so that shouldn't be too hard. I always do these connections when it's early in the morning or late at night so that the least amount of power on the panel is possible, but enough light to give me a voltage reading. So I'm going to put this MC4 connector on the cable, but I'm not going to connect it to the panel string yet. And I'm going to do that because I don't want any voltage in my combiner box when I'm working in it. We're talking, 400, 500 volts, and that's not something you want to mess with. I've started using these connectors from Stabilis. They're a little bit more expensive, but I found that they're compatible with basically every other connector out there, whereas the other ones I've been using, sometimes they can be really tight and not as easy to use. I'm almost always using 10 gauge wire, which would be the center spot on the tool, and I set the connector, crimp it, make sure it's tight, and then all you have to do is slide on the connector and tighten it up. They're super fast and easy to do. Then you can use a little double wrench to make sure it gets tight enough. There we go, ready to go. Now, I'll connect that once the box is all connected. All right, I routed the plus and minus extension cables from the string that I'm installing up through my grommets here. So now I just need to connect them to the input of this 1000 volt breaker, and it's already all set up to connect up to the house from the video I did on expanding my array. Now, I prefer to use color-coded wire, but in this case, I was getting a 500-foot spool, and it's a lot cheaper just to get large quantities of black. So I'll probably put some tape on these to label which one is the positive one. In any case, before I turn the breaker on, I'm going to confirm the polarity real quick. So to do that, I'll connect up my MC4, and then we'll check the voltage. All right, let's connect the string. Check the voltage. All right, there we go, 376 volts. So it's reading positive, which means I got it right. If I got it wrong, it would read negative. And then just to confirm, that will be this string, string number 4. Oh, no power because I didn't turn the breaker on. There we go. Now the way I have this set up, power comes in from the PV panels to the top of the breaker, then it comes out from the breaker to my Dinkel DIN rail lug set here. And I have them in pairs with little jumpers, so I can have 2 lugs for negative and 2 lugs for positive for each string. If you want to see details on wiring this combiner box, just check out my video on expanding my array. You can find it in the projects tab on my website, projectswithdave.com. I'm quickly installing a row of Dinkel DIN rail terminal blocks to allow me to more easily manage the devices I want to connect to incoming solar string. I double up 2 negative and 2 positives side by side so I can easily combine inputs, outputs, or surge protection and never have more than 1 conductor per screw terminal. Tighten those in place. There we go. Nice bus bar. Even though I have breakers in my DC combiner box, I'm going to add some dedicated DC disconnects right under the solar charge controller. That will give me the ability to immediately shut down the DC input if I want to, and a little more control on inputs if I want to swap things out, which I tend to do all the time. Current Connected sells 2 versions of this, one with MC4 connectors on both ends and one with glands on both ends. And I want to do a hybrid, so I'm taking it apart, and it's pretty easy to do. You just use a screwdriver to pop these little caps off, and then 4 screws allow you to just disassemble it. And then I remove the MC4 connectors on the top and replace replace them with glands. Then I can run my PV wire directly from the PV inputs on the solar charge controller into the disconnect switch, and then my MC4 connectors will allow me to connect to my DC combiner box, and I can easily disconnect those and connect up a folding solar panel or some other test panel that I want to do. Anyway, that's just the way I'm wiring it, but of course you can do it either way, glands on both ends or MC4 connectors on both ends. Positive output will be number 4 and the negative output will be number 2. So make sure we get those right. The 6 and 8 and 3 and 5 are combined together to increase the capacity of the switch. I'm using 10 gauge PV wire for my pigtails. I like to use ferrules on my wires. It makes for a more secure connection. The negative is easy. It goes straight in. The positive needs a couple of 90s in a short distance, but I got it in there. Since I'm using black wire for both the positive and negative, I'm adding a piece of red shrink tube to the positive wire for some visual indication. That will help reduce the risk of hooking it up backwards later. There we go. Now we can close it back up. All right, to connect into the bottom with MC4 connectors, I'm going to make up a couple of extension cables that will go into the combiner box, one for the plus and one for the minus. These connectors are very easy to make up. Simply strip the end of the cable, place the pin into the crimp tool first. These are 10 gauge, so I'll put them in the center notch. Insert the wire into the pin, crimp it down, make sure it's straight, confirm it's tight. Then all you have to do is slide it until it clicks and tighten it down. There we go. That'll be extension 1. Same thing for the other. Another solution for identifying the positive extension pigtail is to mark it with some red electrical tape. There we go. To make it easier to slide the pigtails through the wire glands, I put the ferrules on after sliding the wires through. For the moment, I'm just connecting one string to PV input 1 for illustration. In a future video, I plan to max out the charge controller input with all 4 strings to show the max capability. Now, of course, make sure all the breakers are off. We don't want to have any power in here, and I checked with my meter to make sure there's nothing on the back side. 0, 0. Now that the panel is safe to work in, I can connect my MC4 pigtails to the disconnect switch and route them through the glands on the bottom of the DC distribution panel. I added ferrules to improve the connection and red electrical tape to clearly identify the positive conductor. I'm connecting the charge controller to its own bus on the DIN rail. Then I can easily route the string I prepared on the main array to the Victron system until I can finish the wiring from the new firewood rack array. For lightning and surge protection for this one PV circuit, I'm going to use this surge protector from Midnite Solar. I've used EMP Shield for some of my other circuits, but when it comes to protecting the solar charge controller, it's way cheaper to use the Midnite Solar solution. I don't want to mount it sticking out of the box, so I'm just going to use this piece of polycarbonate and make a little bracket out of it. And I thought it'd be a good opportunity to try this new punch from Vevor and see if it can punch through polycarbonate. It says it can punch through 2mm thick steel, so it should be no problem. And hopefully it'll make a nice clean hole, so let's give it a shot. I have to drill a small pilot hole for the RAM connecting rod, then slide on the polycarbonate and the punch with the threaded backstop. The lever is very easy to operate, even when punching through steel. Punched it through, but I don't know how I'm getting it out. There we go. Now we just have to bend it. Well, it certainly had the power to push through it. Gets a little tight with the plastic, but it works. Polycarbonate makes great brackets. It's very strong, but with a little heat, it bends easily. The backing plate on these Vevor boxes comes in really handy when mounting all these components. I really like these bigger boxes because I can keep everything inside and all sealed up. Now, ideally, we would make this as short as possible to go to the ground bus, but I'm likely going to change it, so I'm going to leave the length for now. I'll just connect the ground wire to the ground bus. Now I can just add one of these little jumpers to combine these two lugs and make little bus bars out of them. Now I can just connect the negative to the negative bus and the positive to the positive bus without having to put multiple wires under one lug. These should also be shortened, but once again, we're not doing a perfect layout today. There, now I have this PV circuit that's connected to my solar charge controller, protected from lightning and surges, and we can turn it back on now. Now I can see both lights are on, so we are good to go. I want to confirm the charge controller settings before I turn on any solar power. I can power the unit with either power from the batteries or from the mains through the inverters and the links distributor. Then I can just turn on the power switch. Once it powers up, I can connect with the Victron Control app. With the Victron Control app, I can make sure all the settings are right before I turn the PV on. So I can see all of the available units on my app, and the top one is the charge controller, so I'll click on that. Now that it's connected up, I can see all of its current status information. And then by clicking on the gear icon at the top, I can go to the settings and I'll click on battery. The first setting at the top is the max charge current. Right now that's set at 200 amps. Now, if you didn't use 2-aught cables, or if your battery cannot utilize 200 amps, you need to drop that down. You might also want to drop it down to 5 amps or something until you have everything running properly, and then you can bump it back up. That way you don't have a large amount of current running to something that you don't want it to. So you can just make whatever change you want. I'm going to leave it at 200 because I've already confirmed that everything works for mine, and mine is set up to handle that kind of power. Since I'm going to be connecting the whole system through the Cerbo GX, I can leave that set to controlled by BMS. The other important settings are your battery settings: absorption, float, and equalization voltage. These are the settings for my battery. You'll need to confirm the settings that you need for whatever battery you're managing. All right, that's pretty much it. Now I know all the settings are right, and I can go ahead and add solar power. So I can flip the breaker on and connect PV. Then I can see on the app. And then there it is right on the app, where we're putting out 120 some watts. And from this point, my system would be totally operational. There's no need to connect the Cerbo GX with the apps and computer connected controls for the charge controllers. I can set everything up and have it run no problem. However, I want to have a lot more control. So next, I'm going to show you how to hook up the Cerbo GX and manage the whole system through that portal. I mounted the Cerbo GX in an open space on the wall that will allow for easy access to connect all the communications cables. I picked a convenient height to mount the display. I'm using the surface mount display bracket, which allows the HDMI cable to easily route behind it and drop down to the Cerbo GX. Then I can just relocate the smart shunt below the display and connect the positive sensing wire to the back side of the battery connection terminal on the links distributor. Now I've already powered everything up and made sure the configuration was right. The solar charge controller I can configure using Bluetooth. So I'm able to operate everything without this communications device. And in fact, if you order your parts from Current Connected, they'll pre-program everything for you. But the Cerbo GX is going to allow me to see this system and modify the system from the internet anywhere in the world. And it's going to also allow me to post it on my website, so you will be able to watch my off-grid system in operation anytime you want to. All right, I mounted the Cerbo GX and all the other equipment is mounted. So now we're going to quickly connect all the data connections. The two inverters are connected to each other with this regular Ethernet cable from VE bus port 1 to VE bus port 1 on the other inverter. It doesn't matter which port you use. Then I'm coming off of the second port with another Ethernet cable. This one's gray, and it's going to come down to the Cerbo GX, and I'm going to plug it in to the VE bus port. Next, I'm going to connect the solar charge controller using the VE CAN bus. I could also use a VE direct cable like the shunt, but I'm going to use an Ethernet cable and connect with the VE CAN bus. So for the solar charge controller, I'm plugging into one of the CAN bus ports using a standard Ethernet cable, and that one is routing down here. It's this blue cable, and I will connect that one to VE CAN. Now, we also need to terminate that plug with one of these termination plugs. Next, we have the BMS CAN. Now, I'm going to connect the battery to the BMS CAN. That cable is not a standard Ethernet cable, and you can order the correct cable from Current Connected, or you can make your own like I did. I'll post right here the pinout for how to make the cable. It's not that hard if you've made cables before. Otherwise, just order one. I plug into the CAN port here on the SOK battery, and that plugs into the CAN port on the Cerbo GX. And then I need another terminator to go in that port. Now I have one more communications cable to install, and that is from the Smart Shunt. So I have one end of the VE direct cable here plugged into the shunt, and the other end will plug into one of these VE direct ports. And I'm just going to choose this one towards the bottom. Finally, I'll connect the monitor with its HDMI cable to the Cerbo GX, and that has two plugs on the end. One is the HDMI cable and one is USB power. And then the instructions say to add these ferrite cores to either end of the HDMI cable. All right, now everything is connected appropriately. Technically, you're supposed to use these termination plugs at both ends, so there should be one up in the MPPT, but I don't have enough and it's working without it. All right, now I just need to bring power to the Cerbo GX. And to do that, I'm gonna use the ports on the back side of the Lynx distributor. I'm also connecting the EMP shield to these same ports. All right. Now I can just connect power to the power port. Now to power things up, I'm going to start with AC. If you're off grid and you don't have an AC input, you'll have to start with the battery. If you're working completely off grid and you don't have AC, then you will want to start up with the battery, but you have to be sure and use the startup circuit, and there's a whole process for that, which I've gone over in previous videos. By turning on AC first, the Victron system will apply power to the battery connection points, about 50 volts, and pre-charge the capacitors for me so I don't have to worry about the pre-charged circuit that way. So I'll go ahead and put these in the on position. Boom, power came on. And now I should, as soon as the Cerbo GX boots up, I should see the screen. There it is, booting up. Takes it a couple minutes to get boot up. There we go. Now I can go to the main page here. And it's mad at me because the battery's not on, so I can go ahead and turn that on now. Now I can also turn on the MPPT Charge Controller. And we should see it pop up. There it is. So now I have some power coming in from the grid, power coming in from the Solar Charge Controller, and it's all going to the loads, as well as some power going to charge the battery. Now I have a shunt on this system, and I've connected the BMS can to my battery system because I have batteries with monitoring in them. Now I don't need both. I've set them both up so you can see how to do it, but because my batteries have monitoring, I don't need this shunt. This CAN bus will allow the system to monitor the battery status without that. But if I was using just dumb batteries that didn't have a monitoring system built in, then I would want to use the shunt. I'll have them both on there so you can see how to hook it up, and we'll see how they compare to each other over time. Now with all the wiring done, I can go ahead and cover up all my panels and get everything closed up and secured, and we'll do some programming. I want to set up an ESS on this so I can control when we're using mains power versus PV and the status, as well as the charge rate of the batteries. So let's get some of that software programming done. Now, without hooking up the Cerbo GX, everything is completely operational, and I ran it for several days without the Cerbo GX, completely off-grid with no issues. However, I want to set up an ESS energy management system. That will give me the ability to automatically control when and if I use power from the grid, and to control the charge level of the batteries. Before I added the solar input, I had the system set up to run off mains power unless there was a power failure. Then it would switch to battery backup. Now I want to run off of solar power or battery power unless the battery level drops below 10%. Then I'll supply power from the mains to power the loads until solar comes back on to run the loads and charge the batteries. To do that, there's two main steps. First, I have to set up the Victron VRM, which is a powerful remote monitoring system. And then I need to set up an ESS for configuring the energy management strategy. To set up the VRM, first, we need to use the app or this remote screen to connect to Wi-Fi, or use an Ethernet cable to directly connect the Cerbo GX to your home internet system. From the app, I'll click on the Victron Connect app. Then from the list of devices, I can see I have my Cerbo GX, so I can just click on that. It'll connect to the unit. The Bluetooth connection pin is on a sticker on the back of the Cerbo GX. So I entered that number already. And then from within the app, I can click on the little gear icon, and that will take me to network settings. I can choose a wireless network that's available and enter the password, and now it's connected to the internet. The other option is to use it using the remote screen. From the remote screen, I can go to Menu, click on Settings. I can click on Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi networks, choose an available network, and then I can enter the password and connect to the network. I'm already connected, so I don't need to do that. And that's how you connect using the remote screen. The first thing I'll want to do is go to firmware and make sure that the firmware is up to date. Now that I'm connected online, I can check for updates And if there's an update, here it says no newer version is available, but if there was a newer one, then I could go ahead and apply it. Now to set up for the VRM online portal, or click on menu, go to settings, select VRM online portal. You want logging in enabled. This is your portal ID, which you will need to enter on the website online when you're ready to connect. You want to select two-way communication so that you'll be able to upload to the device. So you want to click on settings, remote console. You'll want to disable password check. So it says password's been disabled. And then you want to enable VRM, make sure it's blue. Mine's already enabled. So you click that. Now it's enabled. And this says online because it's already connected. All right, now we're ready to set up the online connection. So now to connect online, we need to set up an account with Victron. We'll go to victron.com and at the top, click on Login and click on VRM. Then you need to create a new account, put in your name, the rest of your information, a password, and click Register. Once registration is complete, you'll get an email. Go to your email and click the link to confirm, and it will bring you directly to the site. Now from the site, I can click on Cerbo GX, the installation that I want to add. And then this is where you need to type in that code that you got from the Cerbo GX, either using your phone app or the touch screen. So I'll just type my number in there and then click connect. And boom, there we are. It's up and running. I can see online everything that's happening here. Plus this gives me the ability to modify settings, track lots of different things. I'm posting access to this on my website, so you'll be able to see real time what my system is doing anytime you want to. And I'll also add some other information there as to, when I finally get my other array hooked up and how many watts I have connected at any given time, and maybe some information that would be helpful for you there. Now that the VRM is set up, we can move on to setting up the ESS. That's a little bit more complicated because it requires a little bit of programming on the Multiplus 2. So let's go through those steps. Setting up the ESS requires me to change some settings on the inverters. To do this from the web portal, I'll first download the current configuration by clicking on Device List in the menu, then Remote VE Configure. The Multiplus 2 is already selected, so I'll just hit download and save the file as base configuration for easy reference. We need some free software from Victron to do this. We'll go to the victron.com page and click on Downloads. From there, we'll scroll down to the VE configuration tools for the VE bus. I'll click on VE configuration tools and I'll save that to my computer and open it up. Install the software. I want to make sure I have VE configure and VE bus system configurator in order to configure multiple units. Install the software, and this says start VE configure when finished, but that's not the tool we want to start with. If you accept that, it will load VE configure, but because we're trying to do 2 units at the same time, we'll just go ahead and close that. I need to open VE bus system configurator. That'll bring up this window. Now I'll just go and load the configuration we downloaded from the portal, and that's the base configuration that I saved. I'll open that up, click on Inverter 1, then right-click on Inverter 1 and click on VE Configure Multi. That will bring up the tool that we need to modify the settings for Inverter 1. Now these are already all the correct settings, so you can just apply the ones that I have here if you're building the same system. In the US, I have 60 Hertz. The breaker and wiring I installed is good for 50 amps. Before configuring the ESS, I had none selected for grid code because I'm not feeding anything back to the grid, and I don't intend to feed anything back to the grid. However, you have to select a grid code in order to install the ESS. So you need to select whatever country you have. If you're in the US, you'll have to select other because there's no US code. And then the rest of these settings we'll keep just like that. On the inverter, we'll have 120 volts output and the DC low shutdown at 46 volts, restart at 48, and alarm at 48. I'll enable the charger even though I only plan to use it in emergency situations. We have lithium batteries, and these are the settings current connected recommends for the SOK batteries. 57.6 for absorption, 55.2 for float. Now for charge current, you may want that to be 30 amps. I have mine set much lower because if I want to connect a generator or something, I don't want it to be pulling very hard, and I don't ever need it to charge at a higher rate than that. And then these are the settings we have for absorption activity. Now, on virtual switch, I need to have selected do not use virtual switch because we're going to be using the ESS. Then on the assistance page, let me just delete that one real quick. you'll go add an assistant, all assistants, and click ESS, Energy Storage System, and we'll start that. And for flexibility, I will use system uses lithium iron phosphate with other type BMS, and that can be a BMS connected via CAN or a BMS system where the batteries are protected from high-low voltage from external equipment. And mine is on the CAN bus, so that's what I'll use. And then here we'll put in the capacity of the system. Mine is 100 amp hours and I have 5 batteries, so that would be 500 amp hours. We'll leave this in the default. And then for sustained voltage, we want that to be 50 volts. And then these are the settings for dynamic cutoff: 52, 50, 49.2, and 48. For the restart offset, we'll leave that at 1.2 volts. And in my case, I do not have other PV systems connected to the AC out, so I'll leave that at no. And then we'll click OK. And that's it for setting up the ESS on the inverter. One thing I want to note is all of the settings will be exactly the same for both inverters except for the ground relay. On inverter 1, I will have selected ground relay. You can only have one neutral ground bond in your entire system, so you can't have that select on both of them. Now I just need to go to the second inverter, go to VE Configure Multi, and everything on this one will be the same. Grid code other, except for ground relay, with that one will be unchecked. All of these settings should be the same. Do not use virtual switch, and the ESS settings will all be the same. I don't know why you have to set this up for both, but that's the way it works. And then we can just save those settings. Now that all those settings are saved for both inverters, I can go back to the website on the VRM and upload them. Now I'm back here on the website, and instead of downloading, I'll click Upload. We'll select a file, and the file I saved is now ESS configuration, so I can select that. Now it'll write that data up to the units and reboot the system. It takes several minutes for it to configure it, and now it's configured and ready to go. Now I can go to the remote console and go to the menu, click on Settings, scroll down to ESS, select ESS, and now I can put in all the settings that I want to do to make this system operate the way I want it to. For mode, for the system I'm trying to set up, I want to select Optimize without battery life. I don't want to have the batteries fully charged all the time. I want to be able to utilize the full capacity of them. We'll leave grid metering on inverter charger, and we'll use total of all phases for the amount of power going to and from the grid. For minimum state of charge, I had that at 10%, but I think I'm going to bump it up just a little bit to 15%. That way, I will use my batteries on cloudy days, but if for some reason I have lots of cloudy days or use more power than usual and the batteries get down to 15%, the grid will sustain the loads. That way, if the power goes out in the middle of the night, I'll still have 15% of the battery available to maintain those critical loads until the sun comes up the next day. I'm not going to set up any peak shaving. If you're in California or some other states where the electricity rates change throughout the day, you might want to set up a peak shaving situation where you're actually using power from the grid at certain times to charge the batteries. And then at other times of the day, you're making sure you use the batteries and never pull from the grid. The next important setting is grid set point. And I'm going to put 10 watts there. That makes sure I'm always putting a little bit of a load on the grid. Not so much that it's going to consume a lot of power, but it makes sure I'm never backfeeding into the grid. This is an off-grid system with just mains backup. I don't want to push power back into the grid with this system. It's not certified to do that. So I'll put 10 watts on there to make sure I'm never pushing back to the grid. And then for grid feed-in, I don't have any PV coupled devices, so I'll leave those off. I don't need to set any schedules because I'm setting this up as an off-grid system, and the only time I'll ever pull from the grid is if I run out of power. So there we have it. ESS is all set up and ready to go. Let's see how it performs. A couple things to take note of here. On the ESS, we set grid to 10 watts, so it's going to try and hold really close to a balanced 10 watts between line 1 and line 2, not pushing power back to the grid. And then on the AC load side, it's pretty low right now, only 18 watts. So even though it's mostly cloudy and we're only putting 750 watts into the system, the battery is actually charging with 720 watts of that, and we're gaining ground. All right, I've been gathering data for a couple of weeks now, so you can see how the system's actually performing. Ooh, the sun must be poking out from behind the clouds there. We're up over 2,300 watts. Well, that was short-lived. I have 9 375 watt panels currently connected up to it, which is 3,375 watts, which is really close to what I'm going to have when I get the wood rack commissioned. It's going to put out 3,240 watts using 8 405 watt panels. The panels I'm going to be using to power the system on my wood rack are 405 watt panels. I got them from Solar Clearout, and they have all kinds of clearance solar equipment, inverters, chargers, batteries, solar panels. And I'm personally a fan of Dents and Bents and Clearout stuff. I don't want to pay full price if I don't have to. So it's another really great source for you if you're looking for discount equipment, especially for a project like my wood rack. It doesn't have to have anything perfect about it. So I just need low cost performance. And then on the battery side, I have 25 kilowatt hours of SOK batteries that are powering the system. Now up on the screen, you can see everything that's currently running, and you'll be able to see that on my website real time. And if I scroll down here, I can take a look at the past couple of weeks, and the red is power consumed and the yellow is power produced using the solar system. And then this blue line tracks against this percentage battery capacity off on the right hand side. Now you can see I started at about a 65% battery, and right away I had a few sunny days. I got up to almost 100%, not quite. Then the solar production is a little less than consumption, and the battery continues to fall for several days. The daily production keeps it from falling as much as it would, but it's still falling. I get all the way down to 23%. You can see on this particular day, my high was 43%, and by the end of the day, I was down to 23%. And then fortunately, we've got a little bit of sun, in fact, a really good sunny day, 2 decent ones in a row, and I got back to really close to 100% of the battery. The chart there shows 100%, but it was actually just shy of it. And then once again, it starts to fall day after day after day after day, all the way down to today we're at 34%. And the minimum I set in the ESS was 15%, so we still have a little bit further to go. But looking ahead in the forecast, we're supposed to have some partly sunny days coming up, so I expect that'll hold steady and maybe pick back up. Now this is December, and we get very little sun in December, and this shows how you need a pretty substantial battery to make it through the multiple days in a row where you have little to no input from the solar panels. And it wouldn't really matter if I had 3 or 4 times the amount of solar panels connected, because, you know, when there's no sun, there's just no sun. So there's kind of a minimum size battery that you need to support a certain amount of loads. Now you might be thinking, well, how much load do you have connected? Well, I have an Emporia View connected to that panel, my emergency panel circuits. So I've been mapping that, and I have selected 1 week here. So the past week of data from that panel, we consumed 15 kilowatt hours, and 35% of that was the fridge. Then the well was 16%, well behind that. Then the TV and security systems is 15%. Then lights, the garage lights and kitchen lights are both connected to that. Now, when I turn on the garage lights, that's 500 watts. And, you know, I have LEDs everywhere, and I often don't think, well, lights don't consume that much. LEDs don't consume anything. But I have a lot of really bright lights in the garage. The lights got left on all night, one night, and that drained the battery several kilowatt hours. So I've been paying a little bit more attention to when the lights are left on, as they actually consume more than I realized. Then the microwave, even though it's a high consumption device, over 1100 watts when it's running, it doesn't run very often. So it's actually consuming a very small amount. Then there's some miscellaneous outlets there with very little impact. So what this tells me is all of my most critical circuits can be run with 3,000 watts of solar panels and a 25 kilowatt hour battery, even in the wintertime. I'll keep this on the website, and I'll keep adding posts and information as I go. As we go through the December, January period, it probably get a little bit darker. We'll get some snow. We'll see if I ever have to actually pull from the grid in order to keep it running. But this is pretty cool. Really neat learning experience to see what it takes to actually live off grid. And the way I did it is I set up a backup system, and then I made it a little bit bigger, and then I added a little bit of solar and pushed part of my house off grid. And once I learn from this, we'll see how much more I can move off grid. I have to say, this is a rewarding moment in my solar journey. It's a great feeling to know that between my wood stove and this small off-grid system, I could survive an indefinite power outage. I'll provide lots of useful links and discounts in the description, such as 5% discount on VVOR product. You can also find this project on my website, projectswithdave.com, where I'll also include additional information with circuit diagrams, materials, and the live portal to the system in operation. If you want to see the step-by-step installation for the rest of this Victron off-grid system, you can click one of these videos or find them on my website. When my solar power wood rack recycle project is done, I'll post it here as well. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and I'll see you next time.